Hello, everybody. My name is Shana, and I would like to welcome you to this first session of a special mini-series on accessible technology presented by the Ottawa Public Library's Tech Cafe. The Tech Cafe is a weekly and sometimes twice weekly series of presentations designed to increase your knowledge and interest in technology. This presentation is called First Steps in Getting Technology for Your Needs and will be given by Steve Crane on behalf of Ottawa Foyer Partage's ComputerWise program. Steve Crane has spent over 20 years as a support worker for people with disabilities and has a lifelong interest in technology and making. He is a strong believer in the power of technology to change people's lives for the better and is working to increase the presence of people with disabilities in maker culture. ComputerWise is a not-for-profit program that aims to support adults with disabilities in using computers, mobile devices, and other technology to increase their independence and participation in community, employment, and recreation activities. Before I turn the session over to Steve, I would like to let you know that your microphones have been turned off to ensure the best sound quality. You will not be able to unmute yourselves. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat window at the bottom of your screen. Thank you very much for attending this online program presented by the Ottawa Public Library, and I will now turn the session over to Steve Crane. Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. Before I do get started, I do want to take a quick second to thank the Ottawa Public Library, both for giving me the chance to talk to you today and for all of their contributions to our community. We have partnered with them in the past on several projects. Around this time last year, we were collaborating on making face shields on the 3D printers you see behind me to help address PPE shortages in light of the pandemic. We are always happy to work with the local library. As you've heard, I work for a program that supports people with disabilities in using computers and technology. Folks come to our program with a wide variety of goals, and they need an equally wide variety of tools and strategies to reach those goals. That can be one of the big challenges. Two people who have the exact same problem may need very different solutions for it. One thing most of our participants have in common, though, is that the software and the hardware that we all use every day, the mouse, the keyboard, the touchscreen, and the operating systems behind them, aren't designed with these people in mind. They don't fit their needs. Frequently, the technology that should be removing barriers for people has become a barrier. And of course, that's exactly what we want to avoid. Finding the right solution for these issues, it can be very complicated. Every participant in our program needs and deserves a strategy that is customized for them. And the principles that we use to create those strategies is what I'm going to talk about today in hopes that you can also apply them to your own needs. The assistive technology that we recommend for people is part of those strategies, and in a way it is the most important part, and in another way it's the least important part of that process. It's the least important because in and of itself it doesn't actually mean anything. Learning how to use a computer just to use a computer doesn't really have any positive change in your life. But once you have goals, once you know what you're going to use a computer for, then it becomes the most important part because these are the tools that you use to reach those goals. And if you have the right tools, easy jobs become easier and hard jobs become possible. Actually, that's the other way around. If you have the wrong tools, hard jobs become impossible and easy jobs become hard. So of course, the tools that you use are very important. So today we're going to take a look at how we work with our participants to set them up with these tools, how to decide what solution offers the best chance of success, how to get it and test it and evaluate the results. So when you think about it, we as a society put a lot of effort into making our environment safer and more convenient. As soon as we figure out something's possible, we start working on creating tools and rearranging our surroundings to make it easier. We've surrounded ourselves with features to make our day-to-day journey smoother. But of course, there are still gaps. Some of these are natural and unavoidable, but others are byproducts of our own work, of the technology that we use. So these features that are intended to make our lives easier, they're often designed to accommodate the quote unquote average person. That's so that they can serve as many people as possible. Now, of course, we're all different, so none of us is actually average. We all vary from this mythical average in some ways. We may be taller or shorter or heavier or lighter than other people. We might be left-handed. We might see colors a bit differently. And as we vary from this mythical average, a lot of the technology that surrounds us becomes more difficult and less comfortable to use. So most of the time, this is just an inconvenience that we work around and get past, and then we get on with our day. For people with disabilities, of course, these gaps are far more serious. They're well beyond inconvenient. They keep people from being able to socialize, from being able to work. They keep people from performing the basic acts of daily living that most of us do without even thinking about. They isolate people. Assistive technology is technology that bridges these gaps in access and inclusivity. It's tools and accommodations that help people pass these barriers that keep them from fully participating in our society. But here's the question. If we live in this technological wonderland, if we're surrounded by all this wonderful high technology that makes our lives easier, why isn't that being used to benefit the people who need it the most? So the good news there is that, and this may not seem like good news initially, the technology is there. We do live in that wonderland. There are more tools available today to help people with disabilities than at any other point in our history. It's there, it's cheap, it's readily available. Why this is good news is that it means that the challenges we face here aren't insurmountable. In most cases, we're not asking if we can solve a problem, we're just working out how to solve it. So the issue then is getting that technology working for the people who need it. Figuring out what's likely to help, obtaining and testing it, paying for it, and supporting the user in learning how to use it to maintain and foster their independence. Now, we are very shortly going to get to some of the barriers that stand in our way, some of the things that prevent us from doing this. But before we do that, it's probably worth taking a quick look at the considerations that go into creating assistive devices. What makes a good one versus a bad one? The biggest challenge in designing something inclusively, something that fits the needs of all users, is that accessibility isn't a straight line. You don't just generally make something more accessible than it was before. The accommodation that makes something more accessible for one person may make it less accessible for someone else. So this is another factor that contributes to designers keeping to that middle of the road when they design things, with unfortunate results for people out on the edges. But there are some principles, as you can see on this slide, that we take into account to try and ensure that we have the best possible fit for the devices that we use. So the first two considerations are the biggies right off the bat, because if you don't have those, you really don't have anything. If the thing doesn't work, it's not an assistive device. It doesn't help anyone do anything. And if it works, but it can't be used without risk of injury, then there's really a very narrow scope in which you might be able to use it. You're only really stuck with this if not using it causes a greater risk. So that's pretty high stakes, dramatic stuff. Not really what we're talking about when we're looking at day-to-day assistive devices that people use. Now, an important thing for safety is what we're not asking here is there a risk for using this device? It's not a blanket statement. If someone is creating an adaptive device to help someone ski, there's an inherent risk in skiing. So if we stick to the premise that this device cannot have any risk of injuring this person, then we're basically saying that people with this disability can't ski. And that's not the business we're in. We're not limiting people like that. The question that we're asking is, does the device cause an undue risk of injury? Does it make the activity more dangerous than it would otherwise be? So that's the distinction for safety there. Of course, we are looking at a lot of considerations for safety. We're avoiding sharp edges. We're making sure there's no rough surfaces or even places where there'll be a lot of pressure placed on the skin. All of that can cause issues for somebody over time. We look for repetitive stress injuries. There can be, particularly with electronic devices, with how much we're on our phones, there's a lot of Of course, carpal tunnel is the biggest example. And of course, with electronic devices, we are always aware of fire. If we leave this plugged in, is it going to catch fire? We obviously want the answer to be no. It's not enough to look at whether a device is safe to use. We also have to look at whether or not it's safe to carry, to transport, and to store. And we also have to make sure that we are looking at safety relative to the user. Now, this kind of seems obvious, but it's one of those things you always want to write it down because there's always going to be that instance where you're going to forget it. If we have something that's safe for me to use, that doesn't mean it's going to be safe for the actual person it's intended for to use. We're always looking at things from the perspective of the person who's going to use the device. Simplicity is an important consideration. Now, similar to safety, this is not a question of whether or not the device is complicated. Sometimes things need to be complicated and there's no way around it. When you talk about electronic devices, computers and phones and tablets and iPads and whatnot, you're talking about millions of lines of computer code and millions of tiny circuits. They're not simple devices, and fixes for them are often not going to be simple. The question is this more complicated than it needs to be? Often the workflow is you establish that something can be done, and then you look at this big Frankenstein Rube Goldberg thing you've made, and you start trying to trim it down and streamline it and make it simpler. Because the reason we want it to be simple is because a natural outgrowth of simplicity is reliability. If it has fewer components, if it has fewer things that move, there are basically fewer things that can go wrong with it. So that means it's going to need less maintenance, less often. It's going to perform its job more consistently. When someone's using it, it'll need less adjustments. Now, this is important, of course, for all of our technology, but particularly for assistive technology. Frequently with these devices, the person using them is going to have a great deal of difficulty troubleshooting them if they don't work right. If I'm using a custom piece of technology to interface with my computer and it stops working, I need that device to restart my computer or open the programs I would use to fix it. All of those steps for troubleshooting and getting that device working require me to use the device that's not working. There's a bit of a catch-22 there. So reliability is a huge consideration for assistive tech. Good assistive devices are comfortable and easy to use. Obviously, the more comfortable, the easier to use, the better time you're going to have using it. We have to look at things like the weight. Obviously, if it's too heavy, you're going to have trouble using it. It'll tire you out. But in a lot of cases, you can go too far the other way and make it too light. Sometimes that little bit of heft is needed to allow you to control something. If it's a bit heavier, it weighs itself down that little bit that lets you use it accurately as opposed to having it float around. The motions to use it, are they awkward? Are they unnatural? Because again, that'll contribute to repetitive stress injuries and fatigue as you use it. And again, not just while you're using it, how easy is it to set up? How easy is it to put away? Can the user do this independently? That's always going to be the goal. So that leads into integration. Now, integration is often overlooked because when you're thinking of the problem, you're thinking of the user, you're thinking of the device, and you're trying to make those two things work together. But the user and the device are both actually part of a system. You do have to think of how well the device integrates with its surroundings. How much space does it take up? Can the user reach it and everything else they need to reach? Can they see everything else they need to see while they're using it? If you're talking about electronics, does this device work well with the other electronics it's being used for? A poorly integrated device, even if it works, even if it's functional, even if it's safe, even if it's reliable, if it's poorly integrated, it can end up causing problems. And that leads to frustration, that leads to discouragement, a lot of bad outcomes rather. And then we have specialization versus generalization. Now, every device you have is going to have both of these to an extent, and it's all about balance. As you optimize a tool for one task, it gets worse at other tasks. That's why in your garden shed, you have a shovel and a pick and a rake and a hoe. They're all specialized for an individual task. If you need to, you can move a lot of dirt with a rake if you don't have a shovel, but a shovel's better at that job. So with accessibility tools and features, assistive devices, you always have to take into account how specialized versus how generalized your device is going to be. If a device is too generalized, it's not going to work well for the user because it's not going to be good enough at what they need it to do. But if it's too specialized, then they're going to have to carry around a dozen things, one tool for each little job. And of course, that'll present its own accessibility challenges. So you're always going to have to keep all of these things in balance, and you're going to have to weigh them against each other and make some compromises. Now, to see some of this in practice, before we get to assistive tech, let's just look at a good tried and true piece of tech. Most of us have probably already used one today. May I introduce you to the fork? So I wouldn't want to use a fork for my cereal, but generally it does its job very well. As long as I am careful around eyes and toasters with it, it's pretty safe to use. I've never needed to read an instruction manual for one. My parents own forks that are older than I am, so it is simple, it's reliable. Not all forks are as comfortable as others, but generally speaking, they fit well in your hand. If I had plates that forks didn't work with, or forks that plates don't work with, that would be a pretty big problem for that device, right? Now we do see it's pretty specialized because you usually use it in conjunction with two other tools. But if a food's soft, you can cut it with the edge of your fork, or if it hangs together well enough, you can scoop it. So there's a balance that's struck there. So it's a pretty successful piece of technology, and that's why people have been using them roughly forever. But like most things, it doesn't work well for everyone. There are things that we can tweak to make it more accessible for various people. But when we're doing that, we still take into account all of these features, these factors. So if we increase the functionality, we can make an articulated fork that's really good at picking things up. Probably not going to be as simple, probably not as safe. So let's make a really simple fork. And we end up with a stick. That does nobody any good. People have tried to make integrated, very multifunctional forks. So the spork is a pretty good example of that. But you know, I probably wouldn't want to try my luck with a knife. So then we see some actual assistive forks. So we see that the comfort and ease of use side of things is where the real bread and butter is here, where we can have a lot of room to sort of adjust things to make things easier for someone to use. We can change the shape of the handle. We can change the materials to make it lighter. We can make it out of a strong plastic that can be safer if somebody accidentally bites down too hard than metal. We can blunt the points a little bit and still keep most of our functionality. There's a lot of things that we can do there. So whether we're buying a device or making a device, we want to consider these factors. And of course, we're going to have to compromise there. But we do what we can. So now that we know what we're looking for, we know what a good assistive device is. Let's start looking at the real reason we're here today, why that can be so hard to find. Now, a lot of the issues that people encounter here are practical. They're the real nuts and bolts stuff. But before we get to that, I tend to think of that as like more where to start. What we're talking about right now is how to start. Because before we even get to those nuts and bolts considerations, very often we've already put barriers in our own way. And we have to get over those humps. So the first one, yeah, fear. There's a lot of fear and anxiety with this. We can be afraid of how we look or how we might look with an assistive device. We all probably at least know a kid who's been called four eyes in school. Using an assistive device can highlight the fact that you have a disability. And we know that people with disabilities face stigma. So it's, you know, sort of may feel like you're hanging a lampshade on that. You can be worried about some of that stigma, that exclusion that comes with that territory. And that can make people not want to, that can make people think that living with a problem is going to be easier than finding a solution. We can be afraid of losing our independence. It's kind of the other side of the same coin. You use the device, it highlights the fact that you have a disability, and some very well-intentioned people will then decide that means that you can't make decisions for yourself, or that they will decide that you need their help with tasks that you can perform on your own. Losing independence is a giant fear for probably almost all of us, especially as we get older. We can be afraid of getting scammed with retail products, of feeling taken advantage of, or of investing a lot of time and money in something if it turns out not to work. Sometimes we'll be reluctant to look for a solution just because we're afraid that we won't find one. We are afraid of losing that potential for a solution, that hope. And of course, underlying all this is kind of the classic fear of the unknown. Will someone laugh at me? Will I be seen as less able, less independent in my life? We don't know these things, and so they scare us. Now, we're all different. We all cope with things differently. And so this next advice might not apply to everyone. But knowledge and support are, to me, the two largest tonics for this sort of thing, for this anxiety, for this fear. The more you know about the subject, when you know about it, it lets you assess risks accurately. It lets you be able to distinguish between, is this a valid concern, or is this my brain kind of just throwing smoke and making me scared? Because a lot of times the things we're scared of turn out to not actually be that scary once we know about them, and then they're not unknown anymore, of course. If you are unfortunate enough to deal with someone who's unscrupulous, someone who is trying to take advantage of someone, the more you know about the topic at hand, the better you're able to protect yourself. So then you make educated choices. And support is the other sort of side of that coin. It's incredibly important in this to have people to talk to and bounce ideas off of. They can be friends or family or educators, or if you live in a care facility, paid support staff. They can be people at organizations like ours, like ComputerWise, and actually there's a couple of more that I'm going to mention towards the end of the presentation, so don't go anywhere. What support does, obviously, the foremost benefit is if you have someone that you can talk about the things you're afraid of with. Of course, that's grateful. That's absolutely wonderful. I mean, Sesame Street taught us all that. But you may not have somebody that you have that level of comfort with. Sometimes we don't want to talk about things that we're afraid of. Even having a support person who you're not on that level with, someone who is helping you research things on the internet, someone who is taking notes for you at doctor's appointments, any role that they have there can reduce the stress and anxiety in this process and make it seem a lot more manageable. It's always great to have someone to support you, but it does have to be the right person. That's the caveat there. So what makes a good person to support you in this sort of thing? The very obvious answer would be somebody who knows a lot about assistive technology. But that's actually a bit of a secondary consideration. I think if we think about it for a second, we can think of other qualities that if somebody doesn't have those, knowledge of assistive technology isn't really going to be all that helpful. There are two giant qualities that you want to look for in someone that's supporting you here. The first, of course, is you need someone trustworthy. You need somebody that you can trust. Depending on the avenues that you take, the person supporting you may have access to your social insurance number or other personal information. They may have access to your credit cards. They may be sitting beside you in a doctor's office or an occupational therapist's office while you discuss aspects of your personal life. So you need to be somebody that you need to have somebody that you trust with that information. And the other quality is you need somebody who understands what the role of a support person is. They need to understand that they're there to support and champion your ideas, not their ideas. That loss of independence that we talked about earlier, it can be really easy for a support person to victimize. I don't want to use the word victimize because it's often well-intentioned, but it can be very easy for a support person to end up speaking over the person they're supposed to be supporting. Now, if it's somebody you care about in your life, they're going to have opinions, and they should have opinions, and they should be allowed to share them with you. But they have to understand that at the end of the day, the loudest voice in this conversation has to be yours. So another pitfall that can derail this process. So there's fear, and hopefully we've got a couple of tools for dealing with fear. Impatience can actually be as big an obstacle to overcome, because it doesn't seem like an obstacle. When you start this, you're really excited, you want this, you want to jump on the first thing that comes down, solve your problem, feel great about it, and get on with your life. But that first thing, a lot of times, is not going to be the right thing. And so in the end, if it's not the right thing, then that leads to a lot of backtracking and a lot of extra work later on. It can make the whole thing take longer. It can add to your frustration and your stress and your anxiety and everything else. If we're talking about a retail solution, something that you end up purchasing, then depending on the expense involved, you come back to feeling like you got ripped off, or you feel like you're stuck using a device that you don't want to use, or the sunk cost fallacy kicks in and you spend your time and effort convincing yourself that the solution is better than it is. You can avoid all of that if you pull on the reins a little bit. A little planning can go a long way. Of course, telling yourself over and over again to be patient has never, ever, ever helped someone be patient. Much like, telling someone to calm down very rarely calms somebody down. So make a plan and stick to it. You write it down, you rough out your timeline for how long you expect this to take, and you make sure that there are periods, gaps in that plan, where you're taking time to do other things. That gives you time to sort of look at assumptions you might be making. It lets your brain chew on the problem in the background while you're concentrating on something else. Because a lot of these things, there will be a lot of ideas and a lot of questions and a lot of answers that come to you while you're doing other things. That's how our minds work. So you got to give that process time to breathe and give yourself time to have some of these pitfalls occur to you naturally, as opposed to trying to force it all in a moment. Now, some of you may actually already know the perils of impatience because you're not actually starting this process right now. Maybe you're somewhere in the middle of it. You've already tried several devices and you haven't found anything that works. Fatigue and burnout can also be incredibly hard to overcome. When it comes to finding the right assistive device for a person, you sometimes have to kiss some frogs. The idea that you were sure would work didn't work. You're back at square one. Or you've made little changes to something half a dozen times and you're just sick of looking at it. These setbacks and disappointments can be as hard to deal with as anything else. They can overshadow the potential long-term gain of the entire road. A lot of the strategies here are the same as for impatience. You pace yourself, you take breaks. And of course, documentation. Because the worst thing when you're already discouraged is realizing you have to go back and redo something that you already did. That's just, nothing will deflate you quite like that. And a collaborative approach can be very important here as well. Because a different set of eyes can see things that you missed the same way if you can see things that somebody else missed. So there's a little bit of many hands make light work involved here as well. And the real important thing is not to beat yourself up. This is never going to go very smoothly. Nothing in life does. Everybody makes mistakes. What participants at our program are thoroughly sick of hearing me say is that if you've never made a mistake, you've never made anything. So all your mistakes are signs pointing you at what not to do next time. The important thing is to make sure you are looking critically at those mistakes and learning the lessons that they're trying to teach you. Otherwise, you end up repeating the same mistakes over and over again. So there we go. That is how to start, or at least my impression on how to start. Which brings us to where to start. So now we've got our heads on right. It's time to take a look at the nuts and bolts stuff that we haven't talked about yet. We start looking at what are we going to use, where are we going to get it, how are we going to pay for it. In order to get the best results here, the first thing we want to do is define our problem as accurately as we can. We definitely want to be looking at the problem itself and not starting from the idea for a solution. We're not looking at the tool, we're looking at the problem. For example, if someone has a dexterity issue, they have trouble operating the light switches in their house. If you come into that, if they ask you to help them make an accommodation for that, and you come into it saying, okay, they need a special light switch to control the lights in their home. And you're gonna hammer at it, and you'll probably end up making a special light switch, and you'll probably end up with something that they can use. But by being that specific at the outset, you're ruling other things out that might be better. If instead you start from a position of, this person needs to control the lights in their home, that will lead to questions like, are all the light switches the same? So you don't end up making a gadget and then realizing it only works in half the rooms in the house because some of them have dimmer switches or other lights, other types of switch. It opens the door to other solutions entirely, like voice control. That's becoming kind of a big popular thing nowadays. Home automation is a big wave that's cresting. This person may decide that voice control, it never occurred to them, but if you suggest it, they may decide that would actually be even better. And then that may open up the possibility for them to use that system once it's in place for the lights to control other things in their house and have a lot of side benefits as well. So you define the problem as specifically as you can to start with, and then you move on to the next thing where you start listing possible solutions. Now, in the package that accompanying this presentation, this is a little worksheet that I mocked up to illustrate these points. I did throw it in there, so if you want it, you can get it and print it out and see if it's helpful for you. So brainstorming worksheet with your options. Once you have your problem defined, you start looking at what you're going to do to solve it. You want to make a list here, whether it's on this particular form or not. You want to make a list. You want to think about the pros and cons. You want to weigh them through the lens of the considerations we spoke about earlier, functionality and safety, and so on. We're going to want to be looking at all those things, but you're not going to have firm information. There's going to be a lot of guesswork. So what the brainstorming is you're basically listing your options and you're asking questions. Once you sort of have your options listed, then the user takes a look at that and they'll rank them in their preference. This is going to be the prime consideration going forward, not necessarily the only one, but the first and foremost. The user ranks them. Some of these actually won't make the cut. You'll write down an idea, and I do suggest, even if your ideas are bad ones, write them down, because they may highlight a concern that you can apply to a good idea. And some of them you'll write them down and then scratch them out almost immediately, but it's always good to air everything and make sure that you don't leave any, and leave no stone unturned, as they say. So there are your options. You've asked questions and now you set about answering them. For each one of these suggestions, you start, I mean, in my case, it's usually you just head to Google and start looking for products. Does this exist? If so, where can I get it and how much does it cost? Is it possible to get one on a trial basis? Can they be rented or borrowed before we actually spend money on one? It's important to have collaborators here as well, because a lot of these devices are going to be very hard to find. You might know the thing that you're looking for might exist, but it might not be named what you think it should be named. It might actually be used in a completely different sector by somebody who has never ever considered the accessibility possibilities of it. Like, there might be a gardening tool that turns out to be exactly what you need, but because it's a gardening tool instead of an accessibility thing, if you're not a gardener, you're not going to know that you may not know that that thing exists. So having a bunch of people around with a breadth of experience and who have experience in different areas can be very helpful here, because everyone's sort of seen different little slices of the world and the tools that people use for different things. So once you sort of have figured out what exists and what doesn't and what it might cost, you'll probably have a lot of retail products. And there are some big advantages to using retail products for assistive purposes. Specifically, it's backed by a company. If something goes wrong, you're going to have a customer support line or a chat website or a customer service email. You're going to have a warranty more often than not. You're going to have some protections there that you don't have with other options. Now, if something is specifically an assistive device, assistive technology, you're also going to have healthcare professionals that you deal with. OTs, doctors, other people are more likely to already know what this is and be familiar with it. So if it impacts on their sphere, if your OT is working with you on a thing and you already have an assistive tool for that and it's a mainstream retail product, they may well already know what that is and be more comfortable supporting you with it. Now, the downside of retail solutions is that they often will be much more expensive. The justification made by companies here is that they don't sell in big numbers products like this. Pardon me. And if you don't sell in big numbers, you have to make it up by charging more for that product. But the end result for the user is you end up paying a lot more money for these. You also tend to have less customization and less flexibility with them. Many times they are proprietary technology. They're made by a company and the company has specifically made them in a way where in order to repair it, you have to go back to the company, or to use it with other things, you have to buy those other things from that same company. Or if you use this with any other type of device, you void your warranty and considerations like that. There are basically mechanisms in place to keep you spending money with that company. So that can lead to a lot of problems. Of course, the one example is Apple products. If you have to buy your power charger cord, it's a special proprietary Apple charger. A standard USB one won't work. So one example there. So that's the downside of retail. Less customizable, a bit less flexible. So we live in such a consumer-based society, the question there becomes, so what even are the alternatives? What else can you do if you don't want to spend a lot of money on something, or if you don't find a retail product that suits your needs? So we're very lucky nowadays, and this is where the technological wonderland stuff I talked about earlier comes into play, in that we do have more options nowadays than we did before. Open source assistive tech is much more common nowadays. Now, what open source means is that someone develops a product and they want people to be able to use it free of charge. It's kind of the opposite of a patent or a copyright, where it's, you can't use this without my permission or without paying me money. Open source means I have made this for the world can use it. Now, that's often done with the caveat that the person using it can't then turn around and sell it. Because of course, if you develop something that you want everyone to use for free, and I take that idea and start making them and selling them, that's kind of going against your vision. So you'll often find that proviso in open source licenses. But so the upshot is these products are free to use and free to modify. So anyone who knows how to write computer programs can write one and release it under an open source license. So there's lots of free assistive software out there for use on computers and mobile devices. That's sort of where this started more, but nowadays for hardware devices, for actual devices that you hold in your hand, there's more and more open source designs being released. It's really a growing sector because of the propagation of really cheap manufacturing technology. The 3D printers on the other side of the room there mean I can design something, and if I think it's going to help people, I release it under an open source license. So anybody who wants that, they don't have to hire a company to make it for them. They don't have to wait for a company to decide it's a good idea. They can download the plans. Some people own a 3D printer and they can just make one. If not, you can come to your local makerspace, such as the Ottawa Public Library's Imagine Space at the Centerpoint branch, or ComputerWise. When there's not a pandemic going on, you can come here. And you can make those devices for yourself for very low sums of money. The rate that the Ottawa Public Library uses, I believe, is about 40 cents per gram of material. So if you're thinking about something that you make a tool that sits on the table, I mean, you're probably looking at $5 or $10 as opposed to paying, in some cases, we'll use buttons as an example, switches. So a small button that you use to operate something. If you go to an accessibility website, a vendor, you're gonna pay $40 to $60 for one of these. They actually cost about $5 to $10 to make. There's a lot of bloat there in the price. And if you're willing to put in a bit more effort on the open source side, you can find plans that people have made for one and make them at a local makerspace and save a whole lot of money. So the sort of the equation with open source is you're looking at spending probably more effort and maybe more time, but financially you're much better off. And with the amount of bloat in the pricing of some assistive tech, it's often going to be worth your while to at least look into open source. Now, the more extreme version of that is looking at the possibility of a custom designed one-of-a-kind assistive device. So this is somebody builds this for you from the ground up. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of nonprofits. So ComputerWise, we've done a couple of these things. We've made some things for people when we couldn't find something that fits. And we of course are big on open source, where we want to use and employ those solutions for people when they're going to work. There is an organization called the Tetra Society. The Tetris Society is probably a lot more fun, but a lot less useful in this circumstance. So they are a nationwide group of volunteers who make custom assistive devices. You'll find a lot of engineers and woodworkers and metalworkers, a lot of retirees who want to help people out. And you can meet with them, describe your problem, and they'll work towards making a custom one-of-a-kind device. They're entirely volunteer driven, so they are so the cost is actually very low for custom work. Oftentimes they will only charge you for materials, sometimes not even that. So their website is in the package that you got for registering for this workshop, so feel free to check them out, or if you have questions about them, you can definitely forward those to me. On the open source side, the Neil Squire Society, which is another large nonprofit dedicated to accessibility, operates a website called Makers Making Change. That link is also in the package. And what Makers Making Change is, it's a repository for open source assistive tech. People who make these little buttons or any other accommodations that they feel will be helpful to people will upload them on that site, specifically for people to find, download, and use, or contact them to see if you can have it made for you if you don't have access to a local makerspace. So these two routes weren't really options in the past. Tetra actually sort of was, but it was smaller than it is now. But open source tech, it wasn't as common in the past, but now since it can be made so cheaply and so readily, the main barrier is knowing about it. And of course, then there's us, ComputerWise. We do assistive technology consulting. In sunnier times, less pandemic times, I would be more than happy for you to drop by and have a cup of coffee and tell me what problem you want to work on and make some recommendations. But we also do offer that functionality virtually through Zoom. So, right, so that is about what I've got. Our normal programming ComputerWise is suspended due to the pandemic, but we are still operating some services on a virtual level. So if you are, and we also offer remote assembly. So if you look at Makers Making Change, or you find some other source for an open source device that you want, you're sitting on that idea and you don't have the opportunity to make it, you can let us know and I'll give you a quote for us to make it and assemble it for you, and then we can arrange to mail it to you or contactless pickup once the stay-at-home order is done or whatever. So that is a service that we're prepared to offer. Now, if you would like more information on some of the retail and open source tech that is already out there, watch this space, because we'll be doing a workshop in 2 weeks that's more specifically on that. We'll go into it in a bit more detail. We'll have some examples. We'll talk a bit of the sort of advantages and disadvantages of how they're made. So you'll get a bit more info there. And actually, you know what? We actually kind of glossed over a very important question at the start of this. When we're talking about looking for assistive tech, the question you do want to ask first is, what assistive tech do I have? Next week, same bad time, same bad channel, I believe, we'll be doing a workshop on the accessibility features and settings that you already have on the devices that you're using to watch this workshop. We'll be covering Windows, Android, and iOS devices. That's your iPads and your iPhones, all the Apple stuff. And we'll look at what the creators of those platforms have already put in there for accessibility. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. If anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them if I can.
Thank you, Steve. The first person I'm looking for, she's a quadriplegic. She has a system, but it's the operating system is like Windows 7 or something. So she can't upgrade. So what I'm looking for are the devices that she would need, because she has very limited dexterity and she has visual issues. So things like the screen, like being able to talk to the computer. She has right now, she has a Google device where she asks Google for, questions and gets that. But what she wants to be able to do is go on and do her banking, to look up things, to, get forms scanned, the things that lots of people have to do today. So a keyboard, a screen, and an operating system that's reliable, easy to use, that kind of stuff. And a mouse, right? I mean, we need a keyboard and then a mouse, because she has a very light touch, because she doesn't have the dexterity. Does that make sense?
So the system that she uses currently, so she does use a keyboard and mouse.
Well, she hasn't in a long time, because the OS is, she can't use any of the applications because the OS is out of date.
Right. So you actually, it's funny, I was finishing notes on the workshop I mentioned for next week, and some of that actually gets into using a Windows PC without a mouse.
I've signed up for that.
Awesome. So we'll actually talk a little bit about hands-free use for a computer next week.
Okay.
But an overview, I'll do a quick little overview of some of the technologies that can be used. Now, there's two separate issues here. There's the dexterity issue of using the keyboard and the mouse, and there's also the visual issue.
Right.
So from the dexterity side, there are a few things that can be employed if you can't use a standard keyboard and mouse, if they don't really fit what you are capable of. First off, there are completely hands-free tools for using a Windows computer, where you will have a program that your webcam will look at your head, and as you move your head, it will move your mouse pointer, and then you hover over an area of the screen to click.
Okay.
This may be useful for some people. If you can't see your screen very well, that could be useful or not, depending on the degree of the issues there. You definitely can get keyboards that have a much lighter resistance, so they can be used by someone who doesn't have a great deal of strength in their hands.
Right.
Does she move her hand like steadily? Like if she's using a mouse, would there be a problem with?
Most of the time, yeah, most of the time she can. But what I'm concerned about is, I want everything to be wired, because let's say she knocks the wireless, like a mouse, off, and she can't grab it and pick it up, right? I mean, she doesn't have anybody that can run over and say, "Oh, okay, here it is." But
definitely
she does have spasms, yeah.
Because of course, and with wireless, eventually that battery runs out. And if no one's around when it does, then you're just stuck.
Right.
Like, I love wireless stuff. I hate cables, but they are definitely, from an accessibility standpoint, they're much more fallible. They're less reliable, as we kind of covered earlier. So yeah, definitely, and you can definitely buy like a smaller mouse. You can buy, there's a mouse available that has fewer buttons, So some people will only really use one click.
Yeah.
There's also a Windows feature called mouse keys, which instead of using a mouse, the number pad keys on this side of your keyboard,
Yeah.
you actually press those to move the mouse in different directions and perform different click actions. So there's a lot of options out there. To narrow in on specifics, I'd probably have to have a more involved conversation than
Okay.
I'm comfortable having, like, in
Yes,
public.
no, I was just, this is a general question because, if I was to go to, let's say, Staples or Computer Canada or Canada Computer, whatever they're called, right? And I said, here's my list, here are the requirements. What I don't want to have happen is what you said earlier is have to pay a lot of money for something that they said, oh yeah, this is good, because I want to be able for her to use it and bring it back if it doesn't work. Do you know what I mean?
Now, this touches a bit on what we want to do for people here at ComputerWise, where if you see that big metal cage behind me,
Right?
over the course of the last couple of years, we've been building up a stock of different assistive technology things. Some of those we'll actually look at in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
But what we want to be is a place, at the moment we have a lot of long-term people who have come here for years and years, and they have their programming and they do what they do, and that's sort of been our model.
Okay.
But what I want to start offering as well is the opportunity, again, once we're past this whole COVID thing, for people to come in and just sort of play around and try stuff and figure out what works and what doesn't.
Mhm.
So that when you make that list of things and you go to Staples,
Mhm.
you already have an idea of what you want.
Okay.
Or when you go to an appointment with your occupational therapist, you can say, I've been doing this and this has been working well. So what can we do that's like this? Or here's video of me using this system and I really like it.
Mhm.
So long term, that's kind of a role that I want us to expand to fill.
That makes
Short
sense.
term, definitely a more modern version of Windows. The voice control for Windows has gotten much better with Windows 10. Where you can use your voice to type and dictate, but you can also use it to send commands to the computer to navigate menus and open apps and pages and whatnot.
Okay, that's good.
And
Your example with she needs to be able to control the lights. That was a good one because that's something else that she needs. The second person, if I have like 2 minutes, is an older person who fears technology. She wants to be able to video conference with her relatives around the world. And so I was thinking of something very simple, like a Chromebook, so she just opens it, hits the button, and she doesn't have to do a lot of things. Just has to click on things and she can figure, they're simple enough rather than saying, okay, now's the time to update it. So it's like she's the opposite side. She's not computer literate and she needs something.
well, okay, so I'm actually going to make a specific recommendation here just for something to sort of look into, because there could be, again, there's a real peril to sort of doing this in this format because there's so much that I don't know and so many things I could say that, end up being wrong.
Understood.
But there is a product called the Facebook Portal Camera. And it basically looks like a big webcam and you just attach it to your TV. So then if the person has, or you can make for a Facebook account, an Amazon account, a couple of things like that are loaded onto the device, then when she wants to call someone, she doesn't need to use a computer at all. She can sit in front of her TV and say the Amazon magic words, call whoever from her contact list, and it will just do it. So then they'll be on her TV and then she will be on their device, whatever they answer the call with.
Okay, so she needs a smart TV.
This does not require a smart TV. All the electronics for it are in the camera itself.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's a device. We
That's cool.
bought a couple that we're testing for folks.
Yeah.
I believe they cost in the 150 to 200 range. I'd have to check that to be sure.
Okay, well, something for me to look into. That's great. Thanks, Steve. That's wonderful. Thanks, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Well, very nice to meet you, Corinne, and feel free. Our organization's email will also be in the package you'll be sent after the workshop.
Great.
So feel free to contact me for follow-up and we can talk about what we can do for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Steve for this very interesting and informative presentation, and to let you know, as I mentioned in the chat, that you will receive a follow-up email from Eventbrite with links to some of the important resources, including the links to the PDF of Steve's presentation, as well as the brainstorming workshop he used. I would also like to invite you to come back again next week for the second session in this mini series on accessible technology, when Steve will be back to talk about assistive settings and features on the devices you already have. Please see our website for a listing of all of our upcoming tech cafes. Thank you again for attending today's presentation, and goodbye for now.
Thanks a lot, everybody.